My 10 and 20-minute NFL team series continues with the Philadelphia Eagles, and I'm not sure I can go just 10 minutes with the Eagles. There's a lot of stats and a lot of data to present with this team. Last year, they started 10-1, and everybody was anointing them as the team to beat in the NFC. And while they were certainly a tough out for any team, that 10-1 was a bit of a mirage. Their stat sheet didn't look anywhere near like a 10-1 team. I almost felt, and I said this kind of during the year on several shows, that maybe we didn't know that quarterback Hurts was injured or something else was going on with him because they weren't putting up those offensive numbers. A lot of close wins versus teams that were not in their ballpark in terms of power rating. I basically think that they underachieved last year, even during that 10-1 stretch, and we saw it kind of fall apart at the end of the year. And when we last saw Philadelphia, they got embarrassed, frankly, with Tampa Bay, 32-9. First of all, they lost the division to a streaking Dallas team. Was it a streaking Dallas team, or did Philadelphia fade a little bit at the end? They gave up, I'm going to cite a lot of stats at the beginning of the show, 35 pass touchdowns against their defense, which is just too much for a team that's contending for a Super Bowl. Dallas passed them. They had to go on the road. Just like other teams like Miami in the AFC, when they lost out on winning the division, there was a little bit of a deflated feeling, and 32-9 to Tampa just sealed the deal. So what can Philadelphia do to get back after they allowed 46% on third down to opposing offenses, the 35 pass TDs? They had a -10 turnover ratio, and their overall record, 11 wins, but they only outscored opponents by 5 points. By Pythagorean theorem principles, that's more like an 8-1 type season. So we all know that the GM, Howie Roseman, does not like to sit back and watch. That's the difference between Philadelphia and many other teams in the NFL. They were explosive in free agency. And when we get to the draft, we're going to talk about not going to highlight the 8 draft trades they made, but I can tell you that they did make 8 draft trades during the draft process, the 3-day draft process, which is either a record or tied for a record. They had planned all along. They do a lot of succession planning. So when they lost Hassan Riddick on the defensive line, they were already grooming 3 or 4 recent draft picks to take over. They typically built the team from the inside on out, which is one of the reasons why they allowed so many pass completions and touchdowns, because they hadn't been building in the secondary, but they were well prepared, well equipped to replace Riddick up front. They had mostly a net game when you consider that Saquon Barkley, he kind of felt disrespected by the New York Giants. So he moves over from the New York Giants to the Eagles. We know he's going to be motivated this year. Paris Campbell is a deep threat, hopes to win that number 3 or number 4 wide receiver spot. We already know Philly is dangerous with their top 2 wide receivers. They add an offensive lineman, Hennessy. We know Jason Kelce retired. That's a big loss at center. But they also add a linebacker, a well-established linebacker in Devin White, passed with Tampa Bay. And Devin White is a good veteran addition to this team as well. So I feel they actually made a net gain in free agency. And then let's go to the draft. Let me put up the slide with the draft here. And you can see my needs. I would still wanted them to go after another linebacker. They did later in the draft with Jeremiah Trotter, as you see in the 5th round. Strong safety was a need. You need somebody to help these cornerbacks because too many splash plays were being allowed. Youth along the offensive line. They still have some good left tackle, good right tackle. They lost Kelce, as I said, at center. They planned to replace him, but still they need a little bit more youth. There's a lot of people long on the tooth along the offensive line. Now, it wouldn't hurt to add a cornerback as well. What appears they added 2, depending on how they use Cooper DeJean. Quinyon Mitchell was either your number 1 or number 2 rated cornerback in this draft, depending on, they were so interchangeable and had a draft range for me between 15 and 22. So absolutely no problem drafting Mitchell where he was. DeJean I had in the 28 to 35 range. He can be versatile. He could play the nickel. He might even be asked to play strong safety. That'll be interesting. If they deploy him the way I'd like to see him deployed, this really puts a cap on their number. One of their bolded needs. The cornerback was not listed as high as linebacker and strong safety, but these four needs are my most important needs. They're generally interchangeable, and that's a good pick. Another pick for the defensive line in Hunt. He's going to be groomed. Again, he's probably not going to see a lot of action coming from Houston Christian, but Philadelphia always does this where they plan ahead for their defensive line. Will Shipley might be an underrated running back addition. We know this team likes to interchange 2 or 3 running backs in a particular game. They really mix and match carries, and Shipley carries a third down pass catching option as well. From Clemson, he got a lot of good pro-style use there. So I really like this pick. I think he can contribute relatively soon in his rookie year. Ainias Smith was a guy on my radar screen coming into 2023. Injuries set him back. If he builds on his 2022 season, this is a really good pickup, even a gadget type pickup where they can use him in a number of different formations, end sweeps, and so on. He has to be better than he was in an injury-riddled 2023, but a good pick there. Trotter's undersized. Obviously, he has the bloodlines with his dad playing in the NFL, but a good pickup. Keegan adds depth. Actually, both the offensive guard and the center add more offensive line depth. So they did a good job adding youth to the offensive line. And Johnny Wilson is a complimentary wide receiver. So they doubled up here at wide receiver plus Campbell in free agency. Would have liked to have seen them attack linebacker just one more time. But overall, as per usual with the Eagles, they do a good job with their needs. And we know Howie Roseman is one of these forward-thinking guys. Not only did he pull off these 8 trades and still ended up with 9 picks in this draft, but he added extra picks in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th round in next year's draft. So he didn't sacrifice anything. He added in order to make this roster a little bit more complete. Talk about the schedule a little bit because it is interesting. One of the perks, not something that Philly really wanted to do, but one of the perks with having Dallas overcome them is that Dallas ends up with the first place schedule playing San Francisco and other teams, whereas Philadelphia's schedule is not as difficult on paper as is Dallas's schedule. So that's a little bit of an edge. Games 2 to 4 versus the weaker AFC South. Atlanta on Monday Night Football should be a win coming off the Brazil game. So they have an extra, they actually have an extra couple of days because the Brazil game is a Friday. And then they come back from September 6th to September 16th before they play Atlanta. Then they have a shorter week before they play New Orleans. It's their only short week in a plus 12 rest differential. So again, the schedule is favorable for Philadelphia, one short week. They stay on the road to play at Tampa. Then they have an early bye, not necessarily great for a veteran team. Maybe they wanted a later bye, but they can reset in case they're just 2-2 after the first 4 games. Later on, they have a road trip at New York Giants, at Cincinnati. Not especially difficult. All teams have these 2-game road trips, and one of the teams being the Giants. They're very familiar with that stadium and that opponent. I love their last 5 games. My thinking as we get to the season win total and we get the division total is that if they end up at 7-5 after game 12, after the Baltimore game, listen to these last 5 games. Home to Carolina, home to Pittsburgh, where they've dominated. Last loss against Pittsburgh, I believe, was actually 1963 at home. At Washington, a team they're familiar with, and then 2 more home games against Dallas and the New York Giants. This is set up for maybe a 5-0 sweep, or probably at worst on paper, a 4-1, which means that if they've got 7 wins, they can get to 11. It makes me be a little bit bullish on their season win total, But where I really found a favorable odds to me was winning the division, which when I bet it, it was plus 135. It has come down, not significantly. You can find plus 115 and plus 120. Before, they were just slightly behind Dallas in the season win total, or in the divisional win odds, plus 135 versus plus 125. Since then, Dallas has stayed around plus 130, but Philadelphia has been the plus 115, plus 120 range. But still, if you think that the New York Giants can't quite win the division, or the range of outcomes for Washington is they can't win the division, I'm taking Philly head to head over Dallas at the plus one, and I did at plus 135, because they have the easier schedule. They can turn around that minus 10 turnover ratio. I think they can flip the script here. Each turnover is worth 3.5 points. And 3.5 points, if they go to plus 0 turnovers, that's 35 points they make up. So if you take the fact that they were only plus 5 in Pythagorean theorem 8, 8, and 1 type, so they underachieved last year. I understand that. They weren't really in 11 and 16 last year. They were more like 8, 8, and 1, but if you flip the turnovers, they could be more like 9.5, 9, 7, and 1. Then you get the schedule, and then you get a little extra advantage where you have one less road game. And I think you can easily come up with a 10 and 7 as a floor for the Philadelphia Eagles. So I'm going against those Pythagorean theorem principles and saying that because of the turnover ratio, which I expect to flip, and because they were forward thinking, they have a better roster than Dallas, in my opinion. They did more things in the offseason than Dallas, in my opinion. And they have that nice stretch of games at the end of the year to really pour it on and maybe make a big push for not only the NFC East, but also to possibly get a number 1, 2, or 3 seed, depending on what happens with San Francisco. We know they have schedule disadvantages, and what happens with Detroit. So here are my final thoughts. 2023 early season record was a mirage. They weren't as good, and it was noticeable last year for those who listened to some of the podcasts that I did with Las Vegas Chris and others. Howie Roseman did take the necessary steps to improve this roster. 2024 schedule, as I mentioned, mostly favorable. They adjusted will they adjust? I didn't mention this yet, but there will be a new set of coordinators again. Vic Fangio is highly respected. He only lasted 1 year in Miami. I don't know all the dynamics there. There were a lot of words said about his coaching style, but here he is in Philadelphia. I think it's an upgrade. And if the team can adjust to a third coordinator in as many years, I think he'll get a lot out of this improved roster. And then you have Kellen Moore on the offensive side of the ball, where he does a lot of interesting and innovative things. I think he's a good coordinator to have with a quarterback such as Jalen Hurts. So I think they have an improvement at coordinator. I know it's another adjustment, but I think that's an improvement. They finally look like they fixed the secondary. The only other concern is you got that brotherly shove, whatever you want to call it, the tush push that Jason Kelce was so good at doing. Well, Jason Kelce is happily retired now, and he's on the television and podcast circuit. So they don't have him running the brotherly shove. We'll see how that fix it, what that does with short yardage situations. But I think they're going to be quite innovative in that area. I'm bullish on Philadelphia, especially in winning the division. I'll be interested to hear what other people say. Please leave comments on my YouTube. See if you agree with me about Philadelphia. I like their chances when placed head to head against Dallas. Speaking of Dallas, I will be previewing Dallas next week. I believe Monday or Tuesday, with a special guest. Matthew Friedman will join me, and we'll talk about Dallas, and we'll see what he has to say about Dallas's chances, whether he thinks Dallas will continue to be as good or better with as we place them against Philly. Maybe there's still room for both of them to make the playoffs. So go ahead and bookmark the Dallas show next week. I'll have 8 more shows next week as I wrap up the entire 10 and 20-minute NFL team series. Thanks for watching. Have a great weekend. See you next week.